Essay 3. When the Signal Falls Silent. A World Without Digital Entities. February 19th, 2026. Anno Domini. Modern civilization is not merely assisted by digital systems, it is structured around them. Computation governs supply chains, stabilizes energy grids, routes transportation networks, secures financial transactions, coordinates healthcare systems, and mediates communication between billions of people. Digital entities, algorithms, autonomous systems, distributed networks have become the invisible architecture beneath daily life. To imagine their sudden disappearance is not to imagine inconvenience, it is to imagine structural unraveling. The progression of technology has gradually externalized human cognition. Tasks once requiring deliberate calculation are now automated. Navigation, once dependent on memory and maps, relies on real-time satellite positioning. Financial systems depend on algorithmic clearing mechanisms. Agricultural yields are optimized by predictive analytics. Hospitals rely on digital imaging and patient data infrastructures. Governance depends on database systems to track records, taxation, and legal documentation. Computation is no longer a tool at the margins. It is embedded in the core of institutional continuity. If digital entities and computation were suddenly lost, the immediate impact would be infrastructural paralysis. Power grids would struggle to balance loads without automated control systems. Telecommunications networks would collapse without routing protocols and switching software. Air traffic control, reliant on digital monitoring, would revert to severely limited manual operations. Financial markets would halt. Banking systems would freeze without digital ledgers. The shock would not unfold gradually. It would cascade. The vulnerability lies not in technological advancement itself, but in integration without redundancy. As efficiency increases, manual fallback systems are often reduced. Paper records disappear. Mechanical overrides become obsolete. Skills once common, celestial navigation, analog drafting, manual accounting, are no longer widespread. A progressing world of technology assumes continuity of computation. Remove that continuity, and the assumption collapses. Beyond infrastructure, social systems would destabilize. Digital identity verification underpins everything from employment records to property ownership. Without computation, verifying contracts, debts, or credentials becomes arduous. Legal disputes multiply. Economic trust erodes. Supply chains falter as inventory management systems vanish. Global trade slows to the pace of manual documentation and physical inspection. Information loss would be equally profound. Vast archives of knowledge exist primarily in digital form. Scientific research, engineering schematics, medical databases, governmental records. Much of modern knowledge is stored electronically. Without computation to access, replicate, or interpret that data, humanity would face an informational blackout. Books and physical records would remain, but the majority of contemporary documentation would be inaccessible. The cultural consequences would extend further. Communication platforms would disappear. Social networks would dissolve overnight. News dissemination would revert to print and broadcast formats, assuming broadcasting infrastructure could even function. The global simultaneity of experience, shared events, real-time updates, would fragment. Societies would contract inward, becoming more localized in awareness and coordination. Economically, the loss of computation would reshape labor. Automated industries would halt. Manufacturing processes dependent on digital precision would stall. Logistics networks would revert to manual scheduling, dramatically reducing speed and reliability. Productivity would decline sharply. Entire sectors, software, data analytics, digital marketing, algorithmic trading, would cease to exist. A massive realignment of labor toward analog processes would follow. Yet beyond disruption lies a deeper philosophical question. What would this reveal about human capability? A technologically progressing world often equates advancement with reliance. Computation extends cognition, but it can also atrophy certain skills. Mental arithmetic declines when calculators are ubiquitous. Wayfinding diminishes when GPS dominates navigation. Archival memory shifts from human recall to searchable databases. The disappearance of digital entities would expose the extent to which cognition has been externalized. The psychological impact would be significant. A world accustomed to instantaneous access would confront delay. Patience, improvisation, and manual problem-solving would regain importance. However, the shock of disconnection could produce anxiety and unrest. Modern identity is partially constructed through digital presence. Without it, individuals may experience a sense of erasure. Governance would confront unprecedented strain. Emergency measures would attempt to stabilize essential services. Military and security institutions, heavily reliant on digital systems, would revert to analog communication protocols where possible. International coordination would slow dramatically. Diplomatic channels would depend on physical transmission and face-to-face engagement. Environmental consequences would be complex. On one hand, industrial slowdown might reduce emissions temporarily. On the other, monitoring systems for climate, weather prediction, and disaster response would be impaired. Without satellite data processing, forecasting hurricanes or coordinating wildfire responses would become less precise, increasing vulnerability. Over time, humanity would adapt. Mechanical systems would be redesigned for manual operation. Print archives would expand. Analog redundancies would re-emerge. Education systems would emphasize foundational mathematics and engineering principles without reliance on software tools. Radio communication might experience resurgence. A new balance between mechanical and human coordination would form. However, the rebuilding of computation would likely become an immediate priority. Even if digital entities vanished abruptly, the knowledge of their existence would remain in physical textbooks and human memory. Efforts to reconstruct basic computational devices would begin. Vacuum tubes and simple transistor systems could be redeveloped if supply chains permitted. Gradually, primitive digital systems might return, this time perhaps with greater emphasis on resilience and decentralization. The event would fundamentally alter technological philosophy. Efficiency alone would no longer be the dominant metric. Redundancy, analog fallback, and human skill retention would become central design principles. Distributed mechanical systems might be favored over centralized digital dependence. Institutional memory would preserve the lesson. Integration without resilience is fragility disguised as progress. In examining such a scenario, the purpose is not alarmism, but reflection. A progressing world of technology is powerful precisely because of digital entities and computation. Yet their absence would illuminate the scaffolding beneath civilization. It would force recognition that modern life rests upon invisible systems of calculation and coordination. The loss of digital entities would not end humanity, but it would redefine its trajectory. The world would slow. It would decentralize. It would relearn forgotten competencies. It might emerge more cautious, more balanced in its integration of technology. Or it might accelerate rebuilding with renewed urgency. Ultimately, the thought experiment reveals a paradox. The more advanced a civilization becomes, the more invisible its foundations appear. Digital entities operate silently, seamlessly, constantly. Their presence is assumed. Their absence would be unmistakable. A progressing technological world losing computation would confront its own dependency, and in doing so, rediscover the distinction between augmentation and autonomy.
The question is not whether humanity could survive without digital entities. It likely could.
The question is how much of its current structure would survive with it.